Hi, my name is Roberta Pellant. I'm coming from you from Roberta Pellant Consulting, and I have with me this morning Jean-Louis, CEO of Cyber Executive. Welcome, Jean-Louis.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm going to be talking to him about his expertise and talking about what is happening currently in this world. So one of the first questions I have for you, Jean-Louis, is what are some of the greatest challenges your firm has been able to resolve to date?
That's a good question. First of all, I would say that prior to the coronavirus, to the current situation, a lot of executive recruitment in the past decade or so has been done remotely already. There have been some in-person introductions. Certainly, it has been the case with board of directors or permanent position searches, but a lot of the work has been done remotely. So I'm certainly not going to say that this is, this is new or this is this incredible achievement in the past 3 weeks, but we have been able to provide talent in difficult times, in times of disruption, to the client fairly successfully, and in some cases last minute and in large numbers.
Okay, why don't we back up a minute? Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you do as far as talent sourcing? We're talking about virtual talent sourcing, but let's set the foundation a little bit.
Sure. So in executive recruitment, you have the search for permanent positions, which is by and large the chunk of that business, of that industry, and then you have board of director searches. So that's what we do. It depends on the firm, whether the firm is a very large firm. In some cases, in our case, we're a small firm. So a lot of the smaller firms decide to focus on a particular niche. In our case, it started with cybersecurity. We did very, very well with cyber a few years back, and then progressively expanded with IT. We also do other types of placements in finance and healthcare and sales and so forth. But let's say the bulk of our work is in IT. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you. Just to set the context.
Sure.
Currently selling in your company, in your practice? Tell me more about your services.
Our services, we conduct executive searches. So we do search for candidates in the marketplace. Some people do that very successfully in some hard to fill positions. It sometimes does take quite a bit of time, effort, but I would say a good network, a good private network. Passive candidates that cannot be accessed through the traditional means of sourcing candidates, mainly posting ads or searching from them on social media and so forth. I think for certain positions, the personal network is very important.
Great. So what are you currently seeing other than virtual hiring within the marketplace today?
I would say compared to before the crisis, I think what this episode has accentuated, I would say the divide between remote work and on-premise. And I would divide both by two. Again, I would say high skill remote, low skill remote, and then high skill on-premise and low skill on-premise. So we really have four categories there. And I'm not going to say that one is better than the other, but I think it's important to be aware of those distinctions, because it obviously affects the supply and the demand of those jobs and skills.
Thank you. And what does this mean then for employers moving forward and also organizations?
For that, I would think of in terms of market structure.
Yeah.
I would say that in terms of market structure, I traditionally use small, medium, and large, and those are rather loose terms depending on the definition. But I would say that small, medium, and large, very small businesses, sole operators, very small firms, startups is one bucket. You have then the mid-market, and then you have very large companies. And obviously the government, who's also, I think, the largest employer in the United States. I think last time I checked was don't quote me on this, but I think it was over 2 million federal workers. I think for the government, the public sector, and very large enterprises, although they have very large challenges themselves, look at the airlines, for example, they are rather well equipped and well capitalized to organize and survive for their business and for their employees. And we have seen amazing things that sometimes are not mentioned. But you take a large organization like Michelin, for example, which is a well-known global tire maker, right? They were able to redeploy in France in 3 weeks to retool and produce a vast quantity of reusable sanitary masks made out of rubber in 3 weeks. I mean, that's something that in normal times would take 3 years.
Right.
So that's an example of how even some of these very large organizations, in some instances, have been very successful at retooling. I think the mid-market is going to be okay, as well as their employees. But once we get into the mid-market, we sometimes get into situations where the current problems, supply chain disruption and revenue, start to be felt more acutely, and therefore affect the labor force more acutely as well in the mid-market. And then once you get into very small companies, then it can become very, very difficult depending on the type of business.
Right. So if you would categorize the pain points for each of these organizations that you've outlined, what do you think the greatest pain points would be within these organizations?
I don't know all the pain points of Fortune 500, Global 2000. I'm sure there are many, but I would say in the mid-market, which is the segment we cover, the two big ones have been supply chain disruption,
okay,
and revenue.
Okay.
There are others, working remote, getting organized, certain HR instances, but the two big ones in the mid-market have been supply chain disruption and revenue.
Right.
Supply chain disruption can be addressed with the proper technology and sometimes the proper human resources, and there are things that can't be addressed because it has to do with logistics and external factors, external shocks. Revenue, maybe we'll talk about that in a minute, but revenue, I think, is where certain things can be done.
Okay. And do you have any suggestions for a smaller or solo business operator as far as what their pain points other than supply chain, and do you see any other pain points for them? Yes.
I would say for a small operator, it's isolation. So a small operator does not have the network, and they don't have the same problems, but they don't have the same network that a global organization has, or even a mid-sized organization has at the U.S. national level, let's say. So if we say that a solo operator is local, or even national, even in consulting, for a small operator, you do need a network. You need a network. You need national partners, and you need to duplicate and multiply your efforts greatly in terms of building your private network. I think it's very, very important for sole proprietor, even in consulting, to really leverage the technology that's available today, use it to your advantage, and not remain isolated. You're not an island, so build your network.
I know from my experience as a consultant that I have really been using this time to leverage and merge my relationship base and build my network and seek other individuals out, so that when the pandemic does break, I will have formed these relationships with other people so that they can come to me for their solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you, go ahead, I'm sorry for
No,
interrupting.
no, you're absolutely right. And I think I would say that perhaps that may make you smile, but perhaps women really understand what a support system is. So I think that perhaps women understand what a support system is from a natural standpoint, and perhaps it might be even a little bit harder for men to grasp. But I think men, sole proprietors, have to play that game and understand that they too need a support system. Can't
Exactly.
do it. Can't do it alone.
Good point. And I know that you said you wanted to talk about sales a little bit later, so maybe this is a good time to talk about it. What do you see as a possible path or solution, especially for revenue, sales, some of the pain points that you've seen in mid-sized companies? What are some solutions or possible paths that you could recommend to people?
I think there are a number, and I don't think it's one size fits all. I think it's case by case. I think there's a traditional methodology and outlook of the cost approach, right? So you have your fixed cost and your variable costs. So you tend to lower your fixed costs, keep your variable costs the same, or perhaps increase them a little bit. That's outsourcing. That's part of the equation, but I think it only goes so far. I mean, cost certainly is part of the conversation. Big part of it has to be, contained and addressed. But I also think that even in difficult times, you can't um, overlook the revenue side of the equation, and that goes back to sales, business development, building relationships, building your business, particularly if you're small. So that's for the financial side of the business. I think you have technology today that is very distributed, very, let's call it democratically accepted. It wasn't here 20, 30 years ago. Certainly not this kind of sophistication, granularity. Uh, and I think that's a formidable force multiplier for small businesses. And I think the third is really the human factor, and that is really on a case by case basis. How do you think? Do you have an entrepreneurial mindset? Are you agile? How do you reposition yourself? Which type of relationships are you able to build? So that's highly variable and agile. It really depends on the business and the person. And there are certain small business owners in the what I call the on-premise or the physical world. It's out of their hands. The government, certainly in Europe, has by decree you can't be open. So that's not your fault.
Right.
You're going to suffer the consequences. But for those who are in other professions like consulting, it's a different deal. So it's going to be, I think, unfortunately, a crisis that will have winners and losers. And I don't think, it's anybody's fault. It's just the nature of the beast.
Right. You had mentioned that we all have to adapt to this new normal. We have to pivot. We have to make certain changes if we haven't already within our business. Are there any last minute thoughts or comments that you'd like to talk about?
That's a good question. I'll try very quickly. I think there are those out there who make predictions, and predictions can be right or wrong. I think it's instead of playing the game of prediction and speculation, I think it's better to be conservative in the types of outcome and then see where you fit. So you have to consider all possible outcome. You
Right.
look at the unemployment rate, you look at the GDP, you look at the unemployment rate, the policies that have been taken. There are worst outcome and on the other side, extremely optimistic and positive outcome. I tend to think that we will emerge somewhere in the middle. I don't think it's going to be, extraordinarily rosy with a an amazing rebound and will be all forgotten. Nor do I think that it's going to be so catastrophic that we won't recover from it. I think it's going to take some time, perhaps longer than many expect, but we will get out of it.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Jean-Louis. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and I
Yes.
hope to talk to you at another point.